Welcome to Hidden Pages of Slavery. A 1902 studio photograph was recovered, and historians were left stunned when the image was enhanced. The photograph arrived at the Massachusetts Historical Society inside a worn leather portfolio donated by an estate sale coordinator who had discovered it hidden in a collapsing Victorian desk. The portfolio itself was plain brown, cracked along the edges, with brass clasps dulled by age. But when archivist David Morrison slowly opened it and looked at the studio portrait inside, something made him stop. If you like real and hidden history, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you're watching, don't forget to comment your good name and the name of your beautiful country below. The image showed a well-dressed couple standing inside a photographer's studio, the kind of formal portrait that was common in Boston at the turn of the century. The man wore a dark suit with a stiff high collar, his mustache neatly trimmed, one hand resting in a protective way on the shoulder of a young girl who stood between them. The woman beside him wore an ornate dress with lace details, her face calm, almost unnaturally calm. The child, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, stared straight into the camera with wide, serious eyes. David had examined thousands of photographs from this period. Most of them told simple stories, families recording their lives, their success, their place in society. But this photograph felt different. The studio backdrop showed painted columns and hanging fabric, typical for 1902, and the photographer's stamp was embossed in the corner, J.P. Whitmore Studio, Boston, Mass. David placed the photograph beneath the magnifying lamp on his desk and adjusted the light to study it more closely. The couple's clothing suggested wealth. The material looked costly, and the tailoring was exact. As David continued to study the image, his trained eye began to notice small inconsistencies. The woman's posture seemed stiff, almost staged. The man's smile did not reach his eyes. And the child, there was something about the way she held herself, a tightness in her small body that felt strange for a normal family portrait. David made a note to search the Whitmore studio archives. Perhaps there were sitting books with names and dates. He photographed the image with his digital camera, carefully capturing every detail, then returned the original to its acid-free protective sleeve. As he uploaded the image to his computer to enhance and catalog it, David felt the familiar spark of curiosity that had drawn him to archival work in the first place. Every photograph was a window into the past, but some windows revealed far more than others. This one, he suspected, might hold a story worth uncovering. He did not yet know how right he was, or how deeply that story would shake everything historians believed about this seemingly ordinary family portrait. 3 days later, David sat in the digital restoration lab with Emma Chen, the Society's imaging specialist. Emma had worked with historical photographs for 15 years, pulling hidden details from faded daguerreotypes and damaged tintypes that appeared beyond saving. She approached each image like a forensic expert, uncovering layers invisible to the naked eye. "This one is in very good condition," Emma said, as she adjusted her glasses, and the high-resolution scan appeared on her screen. The studio used quality materials. The gelatin silver print has aged well. David pulled a chair next to her. He said he wanted to see everything, the clothing, the jewelry, the studio props, anything that might help identify the people in the photo. Emma's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as she applied filters and adjustments. The image sharpened, contrast deepened, and shadows lifted to expose hidden details. She zoomed in on the woman's hands, folded neatly at her waist. The lace on the dress became sharp, with individual threads now visible. Then she shifted her focus to the jewelry. "Look at this," Emma said, her voice suddenly tight. On the child's chest, almost invisible in the original print, hung a small oval locket on a thin chain. Emma enhanced the area, bringing the locket into focus. An engraving appeared on its gold surface, delicate and decorative. "Can you read that?" she asked. David leaned closer as Emma increased the magnification and sharpened the image further. The letters became clear. M-E-R, David said, writing it down in his notebook. They were not initials that matched any common naming pattern he knew from Boston families of 1902. Emma was already examining another part of the photograph. She zoomed into the background, where the painted studio columns stood. Behind them, barely visible, was a small table holding what looked like studio props. A vase, a few books. decorative objects meant to be used as needed. "David, look at this," Emma said softly. She enhanced part of the table, and suddenly an object became clear, a small framed photograph, turned slightly, as if someone had been looking at it and set it down without care. The frame appeared ornate, possibly silver, and inside it was another portrait, a woman holding an infant. The image was older and more faded. "Why would there be another family photograph in the background of this one?" Emma asked. David's thoughts raced. Unless it was not meant to be there, unless the photographer missed it, or someone wanted it included. Emma finished the thought quietly, calling it evidence. They stared at the screen in silence. The next morning, David went to the Society's newspaper archive, a climate-controlled room filled with digitized records from every major Boston publication going back to the 1780s. He began with 1902, searching for reports of missing children, strange family situations, or anything connected to the Whitmore studio. The Boston Globe's social pages were full of the usual notices: weddings, births, social events, charity gatherings, business news and political reports filled the rest. But it was in the Evening Record, a smaller paper known for crime stories and human interest pieces, that David found his first real lead. A headline dated March 15, 1902 read, "Tragic fire claims 3 lives in South End, mother and 2 children perish." David's heart began to pound as he read. A tenement fire had broken out early in the morning, trapping a young mother and her 2 children on the 3rd floor. The father, a railway clerk, had been working a night shift and returned to find his home destroyed and his family gone. The victims were named as Margaret Russell, age 28, and her children, Eleanor, age 6, and infant Thomas, Margaret, Eleanor, Russell. "M.E.R., David whispered. His hands shook slightly as he wrote his notes. Could the locket have belonged to Eleanor Russell? He needed to find a photograph of the Russell family, some way to compare the child in the studio portrait with Eleanor. He searched for follow-up articles and found several. The fire had deeply affected the neighborhood. Harold Russell, the father, was described as broken with grief. A fund had been created to help pay for burials and the railway workers. Association had organized a memorial service. Then the record ended. Harold Russell vanished from public documents after April 1902. There was no death record, no further newspaper mentions. David searched city directories, census files, employment records, nothing. It was as if Harold Russell had simply disappeared. David leaned back in his chair, thinking through the possibilities. A man loses his entire family in a fire. 6 months later, a studio portrait appears of a wealthy couple with a child wearing a locket that may carry the dead daughter's initials. The timing felt too exact to be random. He needed to learn more about the couple in the photograph, and he needed to find out what became of Harold Russell. The Whitmore studio had closed in 1928, but its records were preserved by the Boston Photographic Historical Collection near the waterfront. David called ahead and spoke with the curator, an elderly man named Thomas Brennan, who had spent 40 years documenting the city's photographic history. "The Whitmore sitting books are incomplete," Thomas warned when David arrived later that day. "There was water damage in the 1950s, and some records were lost. But we do have several ledgers from the early 1900s. David explained he was looking for dates in late 1902, likely between September and November. Thomas led him to a wooden cabinet and carefully removed a leather-bound ledger. The pages were fragile and yellowed, filled with neat handwritten entries in fading ink. Each line listed a client's name, date of sitting, number of plates used, and payment. They found the entry dated October 12, 1902, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Bennett with daughter, formal family portrait, 3 plates, $5, paid in full. David carefully copied the names. He asked if there was an address. Thomas pointed to a note in the margin, 142 Commonwealth Avenue. That address would have been extremely prestigious at the time. David felt the pieces starting to come together. A wealthy couple in Back Bay. A formal portrait taken months after a deadly fire destroyed a working-class family in the South End. David asked if Whitmore kept any personal notes beyond business records. Thomas hesitated, then said Whitmore had apparently kept a private journal, separate from the ledgers. It contained personal observations about clients and notes on unusual sessions. The journal was incomplete and damaged, but it existed. Thomas retrieved a smaller, more worn book and said quietly that they did not allow many researchers to see it. "Privacy concerns, you understand?" Thomas said. David nodded seriously. "I understand. But this is important. I believe this photograph may record something meaningful." Thomas studied David's face for a long moment, then slowly opened the journal to October 1902. The entries were brief, written in a looser, more personal hand than the official business ledgers. Most notes were ordinary comments about lighting or equipment, but one entry dated October 13th, the day after the Bennett sitting, was much longer. David read Whitmore's words carefully, his heart racing. "Yesterday's sitting continues to trouble me. The couple who gave the name Bennett arrived exactly at 2 as arranged. The gentleman was well-dressed and polite in every way, yet he appeared uneasy, often checking his pocket watch and adjusting his collar. The lady was calm but distant and spoke very little. It was the child who concerned me most. She could not have been more than 6 years old, a lovely child with dark curls. Yet she did not speak a single word during the entire session. When I tried to engage her, asking her name, her favorite toy, anything to bring out a natural look, she only stared." The lady, calling herself Mrs. Bennett, quickly interrupted, and Sir, the child was shy and not used to strangers. But what I observed was not shyness. It was fear. The gentleman placed the child between them with a firm hand, almost as if claiming possession. I noticed the lady adjust something at the child's neck, a gold locket catching the light. When she touched it, the child flinched. It was very slight, but I saw it. I have photographed hundreds of families. I know the difference between a child uneasy with a camera and a child uneasy with her situation. This was the second. I said nothing. It is not my role to question a client's private life. But as they were leaving, the child turned and looked back at me. In that moment, I saw something in her eyes. Perhaps a silent plea, or perhaps resignation. I cannot say. I developed the plates this morning. The portrait is technically flawless, sharp focus, balanced composition, correct exposure. Yet when I look at it, I see only questions. Who are these people, and why did that child look so deeply unhappy? David read the passage 3 times. Whitmore had sensed that something was wrong, something seriously wrong, yet he had taken no action. Perhaps he had convinced himself he was imagining it. Or perhaps, like many people in 1902, he believed family matters were private and should not be questioned. "This is extraordinary," Thomas said quietly. "In all my years with these records, I've never known Whitmore to show such personal concern about a client." David photographed the journal page, carefully capturing every word. He then returned to the ledger to look for any other references to the Bennetts. There were none. They appeared once, had their portrait taken, and never came back. "What about the address?" David asked. 142 Commonwealth Avenue. Can we see who lived there in 1902? Thomas led him to another set of records, property registers and city directories. The search took over an hour, but they eventually found the listing. The house at 142 Commonwealth Avenue was owned by Charles Bennett, a textile merchant, and his wife Catherine. They had lived there from 1898 until 1904, when the property was sold. "Do we know what happened to them after 1904? David asked. Thomas checked later directories from 1905, 1906, and 1907. Charles Bennett appeared in the 1905 directory at a new address in Brooklyn, still described as a textile merchant. By 1906, his name disappeared entirely from Boston records. "They left the city," Thomas said. "Not unusual for wealthy families, but the timing matters." David agreed. The Bennetts had stayed in Boston for 2 years after the portrait was taken, then left suddenly. What happened in 1904 that made them move? David needed to know more about Charles and Catherine Bennett, their business, their social ties, and their past before they walked into that studio with a frightened child wearing a dead girl's locket. Back in his office, David widened his investigation. If Eleanor Russell was truly the child in the photograph, and if the Bennetts had taken her after the fire, there had to be a link. He returned to Harold Russell, the father who had lost his family and then vanished. Records from the Railway Workers Association said Russell worked as a clerk. David contacted the Boston and Albany Railroad archives and requested employment records from 1900 to 1903. 2 days later, the reply arrived. Harold Russell had been employed as a freight clerk from 1899 until March 1902, when he stopped coming to work shortly after the fire. There was an additional note in his file. Wages discontinued due to absence. Final payment held pending forwarding address, never claimed. A man loses his family and leaves his job without collecting his last wages. The grief must have been unbearable, David thought, but where had Roos? Cell gone. He searched hospital records, asylum admissions, even prison files, wondering if Russell had suffered a breakdown or committed some desperate act. There was nothing. It was as if Harold Russell had stepped out of his life and disappeared. Then David had another idea. He turned back to Charles Bennett's business history. Bennett was listed as a textile merchant, but David looked deeper. He requested commercial registration files and discovered that Bennett and Associates supplied textiles to several major clients, including the Boston and Albany Railroad. Bennett provided fabric for railway car interiors and worker uniforms. That meant regular contact with railway offices, including the freight department where Harold Russell worked. The connection was clear. Bennett and Russell would have crossed paths, at least professionally, but how did that lead to Bennett having Russell's daughter months after her supposed death? David sat quietly, building theories. The fire had officially killed 3 people, with bodies identified and buried. But what if one identification had been wrong? What if, in the chaos of the fire, mistakes had been made? What if Eleanor Russell had survived, and Charles Bennett had taken her? The question was why. And the darker question was whether it had been rescue or abduction. David's major breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. While searching county medical records for any trace of Harold Russell, he found a different name: Catherine Bennett. The record came from the Brooklyn Psychiatric Hospital, dated November 1903. Catherine Bennett, age 34, had been admitted for treatment of severe depression and nervous illness. The admission notes were short but revealing. Patient shows signs of deep guilt and emotional distress, repeatedly speaks of a child, claims the child is not hers, expresses desire to confess anew, unspecified wrongdoing. Husband reports these thoughts began approximately 1 year ago without clear cause. 1 year earlier would place the start of Catherine's symptoms in late 1902, exactly when the studio portrait was taken. David requested the full medical file. It arrived a week later, and its contents were heartbreaking. Catherine had remained hospitalized for 7 months and had been interviewed many times. Doctor's notes described a woman overwhelmed by remorse. Patient remains focused on a child she calls the girl. When asked for clarification, patient becomes agitated, states child does not belong to her, claims husband brought the child home and insisted they present her as their own. Patient says the child's mother is dead and that the child should be returned to her rightful family. When pressed for details, patient becomes incoherent and weeps uncontrollably. Another note dated January 1904 stated that the patient's husband visited and dismissed her statements. He claimed she had suffered a miscarriage 2 years earlier and had become obsessed with the idea of adopting a child. He insisted there was no truth to her claims about a child in their home. He appeared eager to remove her from hospital care, saying he had arranged private treatment in New York. Catherine Bennett was transferred to a private sanatorium in upstate New York in March 1904. The trail ended there. No more records, no indication of what happened to her afterward. But her words, dismissed as delusions by doctors and her husband, matched David's theory exactly. Charles Bennett had brought a child home, forced the story that she was theirs, and when Catherine's conscience could no longer accept the lie, she collapsed under the weight of guilt. David now had enough evidence to form a clear narrative. Through his work with the railroad, Charles Bennett had learned about the Russell family tragedy. Perhaps he had even been present in some official role after the fire. And in the confusion, he had taken Eleanor Russell, convincing himself he was saving her, or simply taking advantage of the chaos to obtain the child he and his wife wanted. Still, David needed proof. He needed to find Eleanor herself, or at least trace her life after 1904. The next clue came from an unlikely place. David posted a question on a genealogy forum asking for information about the Bennett family of Boston. 3 days later, he received a reply from a woman named Patricia Hughes in Connecticut. She wrote that her grandmother had attended Worthington Academy for Girls in Western Massachusetts from 1908 to 1914 and had kept a yearbook. Patricia remembered seeing the name Bennett among the students and offered to check. David replied immediately, sharing the approximate age. Eleanor would have been born around 1896, making her about 12 in 1908, the right age for boarding school. Patricia's next message included a scanned photograph of a yearbook page from 1912 showing graduating students. Among them was Eleanor Bennett, age 16, listed as originally from Boston, with residence given as New York. David's hands shook as he enlarged the image. The girl in the photograph was older now, her features more mature, but there was something in her eyes, the same serious intensity David had seen in the studio portrait. Around her neck, barely visible, hung a delicate chain. He immediately contacted the Worthington Academy. Although the school had closed in 1956, its records had been preserved by the local historical society. David explained his research, and the archivist agreed to search for Eleanor Bennett's files. What arrived 2 weeks later went beyond his expectations. The documents included admission records, correspondence, and most importantly, an emergency contact form. Eleanor Bennett had been enrolled in 1908 by Charles Bennett of Albany, New York, who listed himself as her guardian, not her father. The form included a note, parents deceased, no other living relatives. But there was more. Tucked into her file was a letter dated June 1914, written in a careful young woman's hand, addressed to whom it may concern. She wrote that she would not be returning to school, as her guardian had passed away, and she wished to pursue work independently. She thanked the faculty for their kindness, but revealed something extraordinary. The name she had been using, Eleanor Bennett, was not her real name. She was Eleanor Russell. Her mother had been Margaret Russell, who had died in a Boston fire in 1902. She did not know why she had been taken from her father or how she had come to live under another name, but she intended to find out. Now 18, she was determined to uncover the truth about her identity and what had been done to her. David immediately began searching for Eleanor Russell after 1914. The trail was challenging. A young woman traveling alone, possibly using different names in an era when records were inconsistent. But fragments appeared. A boarding house registry in Springfield listing an E. Russell in 1915, an employment record from a textile factory in Lell showing her hired as a clerk in 1916. Then, in the Boston City archives, he found the record he had been seeking, a legal petition filed in 1918. Eleanor Russell, age 22, was requesting access to records regarding the 1902 tenement fire that had supposedly claimed her life, along with her mother and infant brother. David obtained the full court file. Eleanor's petition included a sworn statement detailing everything she had uncovered about her past. Her account was precise and heartbreaking. She remembered fragments of the fire, the smoke, her mother screaming, being carried outside by a neighbor. She remembered being taken to a hospital, confused and terrified. Days later, a well-dressed man told her that her father had died of grief, and that she had no family left, and that he and his wife would care for her. That man had been Charles Bennett. Over 4 years of investigation, Eleanor had pieced together the truth. The fire had killed her mother and infant brother. She had survived, but in shock, barely able to speak. In the chaos at the hospital, with multiple victims from different tenements arriving simultaneously, record-keeping had been confused. A nurse, exhausted and overwhelmed, had mistakenly recorded Eleanor as deceased along with her mother and brother. Charles Bennett, who had been at the hospital offering assistance to families of railway workers, overheard discussions about the Russell case. He learned that Harold Russell, Eleanor's father, believed his entire family dead and was in deep despair. Bennett also knew that no relatives had come forward to claim the surviving child. Bennett and his wife Catherine had been unable to have children, suffering multiple miscarriages. There, in that hospital, was an opportunity. A child with no family, no one to claim her, no one to question her disappearance. Bennett presented himself to the hospital as a concerned businessman offering help. He arranged for Eleanor's discharge into his care, claiming he would ensure she reached distant relatives. Instead, he took her home, and over the following months, he and Catherine systematically erased Eleanor Russell and created Eleanor Bennett. The locket with her mother's initials was the only connection she was allowed to keep. Perhaps Catherine had insisted, unable to completely erase the truth. As for Harold Russell, Eleanor's investigation revealed the darkest truth. Her court petition included evidence David had not yet found. Harold Russell had not simply vanished. In May 1902, 2 months after the fire, his body was recovered from Boston Harbor. His death was ruled a suicide, a father unable to live without his family. But the coroner's report noted something unusual: bruises on his arms and torso inconsistent with drowning alone, suggesting a possible struggle before death. In 1902, with no witnesses and an apparent motive for suicide, no further investigation was pursued. Eleanor argued that Charles Bennett's actions, taking her from the hospital under false pretenses and allowing her father to believe she was dead, had directly contributed to his despair. If Harold had known his daughter survived, she argued, he might have had reason to live. The court granted Eleanor access to all relevant records but declined criminal charges. Charles Bennett had died in 1930, and Catherine Bennett passed away in the New York sanatorium in 1907, never recovering from her breakdown. There was no one left to prosecute. Yet Eleanor achieved something far more important than legal justice. She reclaimed her identity. The court officially recognized her as Eleanor Russell, daughter of Harold and Margaret Russell, and granted her access to her father's unclaimed wages and small estate. David found one final record. Eleanor Russell married in 1920, moved to Providence, Rhode Island, and lived until 1968. She worked for decades advocating for orphan children, helping establish rules and oversight for adoption to prevent tragedies like her own. When David finally compiled his research for the Historical Society, the studio portrait gained its full meaning. It was not just a family photograph. It was evidence of an abduction, a record of a crime committed in PLA. In sight, preserved by a photographer who had sensed something wrong but did not know how to act. Emma enhanced the image one final time, bringing every detail into sharp focus. The locket with Margaret Russell's initials, the tension in Eleanor's small frame, the guilt visible in Catherine Bennett's rigid posture, the calculated hand of Charles Bennett on the child's shoulder. This photograph, David said at the presentation, is a testament to resilience. Eleanor Russell spent her childhood as someone else, but she never stopped being herself. And when she was old enough, she fought to reclaim her identity and ensure other children would be protected from similar fates. The image that once seemed ordinary, a wealthy couple with their daughter in a Boston studio, revealed a story of loss, deception, and ultimately, determination. Eleanor Russell had been stolen, renamed, and nearly erased from history, but she survived. She remembered. She made sure her truth would not be forgotten. The photograph remained on display at the Historical Society with a full plaque explaining Eleanor's story. Visitors stopped, studied the image, and saw what the photographer had noticed in 1902, a child who did not belong, a family that was not a family, and a moment of profound injustice captured forever in silver and light.